The town of Redemption, Colorado, baked under a sun that offered no mercy. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything: the sagging porches of the general store, the unpainted clapboard of the saloon, and the soul of Grace Evans as she stood in the sliver of shade offered by the livery stable. She had arrived 2 hours ago on a freight wagon, a canvas satchel containing her entire world clutched in one hand. Her plan was simple: disappear. Find a place so remote, so quiet that the ghosts of Kansas could not follow. A commotion from across the street shattered the afternoon stupor. A man dressed in a tailored black coat that defied the oppressive heat stood before a farmer and his wife. The farmer was a gaunt man, his skin cured to leather by sun and worry. His wife stood half hidden behind him, clutching a faded calico dress. Progress, Mr. Abernathy, has a way of clearing its own path. The man in black said, his voice a low, cultured murmur that carried an unnerving chill. Your plot of land is simply in the way. It's all we have, Mr. Blackwood, the farmer pleaded, his voice cracking. My family's been on that land for 2 generations. Silas Blackwood smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips. He was handsome in a severe way, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. He radiated a kind of patient, unyielding power. History is a luxury, my friend. The future requires sacrifice. I have made you a fair offer. It is my final offer. He reached into his waistcoat, his movements deliberate and smooth. Grace's breath caught in her throat. He pulled out a silver pocket watch, its surface intricately engraved with swirling filigree. He flipped open the cover with a soft, metallic click. The sound pierced the ears, dragging Grace back to a cold Kansas night. The smell of lamp oil and blood. Her father, the preacher, lying on the floor of his study, his books scattered around him like fallen leaves. And a man standing over him, a man whose face was lost to shadow, but whose hand held that exact watch, its silver gleam, the last thing she saw before she fled into the darkness. Click! Blackwood snapped the watch shut. The sound jolted Grace back to the present. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. It was him. Maybe not the man who pulled the trigger, but he was there. That watch was a brand on her memory, a symbol of the end of her world. The man who had taken her father's life, or who had stood by while it was taken, was here in this dusty, forgotten town. You have until sundown to reconsider, Blackwood said to the farmer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. After that, progress will simply have to roll over you. He tipped his hat, a gesture of mock politeness, and strode toward the saloon, his polished boots leaving sharp, confident prints in the thick dust. The farmer and his wife stood frozen, 2 figures of despair etched against the glare. Grace shrank back into the shadows of the livery, her knuckles white where she gripped her satchel. Redemption was no sanctuary. It was a trap. She had to run again, farther this time. She turned to the stable master, a grizzled old man cleaning a harness. Is there any work? Far from here, she asked, her voice tight. Something isolated. The old man squinted at her, taking in her worn boots and the desperate set of her jaw. Far and isolated. Well, there's Calder Hayes. Rancher. Lives 10 miles north up near the mesas. Hasn't come to town in months. Lost his wife last year. Folks say the grief soured him something awful. He spat a stream of tobacco juice. He sent a rider in last week looking for a cook. Someone to bake bread. Said he'd pay well long as they kept to themselves. Doubt he found anyone foolish enough to take it. Foolish was exactly what Grace needed to be. How do I get there? An hour later, she was perched on the back of another wagon, this one laden with grain, rumbling north out of Redemption. The town shrank behind her, but the image of the silver watch was burned into her mind. The job was no longer just a means of survival. It was a hiding place. She was not running toward a new life, but away from a death she was certain would come looking for her. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain, and for the first time in a long time, Grace Evans prayed. not for salvation, but for invisibility. The road to the Hayes Ranch was less a road than a scar upon the land. It wound through cracked earth and stubborn sagebrush, climbing steadily toward a horizon dominated by the flat, bruised purple of the distant mesas. The sun hammered the cracked earth into a mosaic of baked red clay. When the wagon finally crested a low rise, the ranch came into view, a lonely collection of buildings huddled against the vast, indifferent landscape. It looked less like a home and more like a final outpost against the wilderness. Grace thanked the driver and slid to the ground, her satchel landing with a soft thud. The ranch was quiet in the afternoon heat. Horses shifted in the corral, their ears flicking at flies. Men worked in the distance, sleeves rolled heads low, their movements economical and weary. And then he appeared emerging from the long shadow of the barn. He walked with a measured, heavy gait, a man more worn than old, his hat pulled low. Calder Hayes. He did not offer a hand, did not ask what brought her so far from civilization. He simply looked her over, once a quick assessing glance from head to boot, as if measuring her for a coffin or saddle. His face was a landscape of its own, carved with lines of grief and hard living. "I need someone to bake bread," he said, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "I do not need someone telling stories or asking questions." "I am here for the work," Grace replied, her voice calm and clear, betraying none of the terror that still coiled in her stomach. Not to get in the way of anyone's life. He seemed to consider this, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer. He gave a single sharp nod. "The job's for 2 months. You bake every morning. Enough for the hands and extra for the Saturday market. And where do I sleep?" He turned and pointed to a small, weathered shed, nestled beside the main barn, its wood bleached gray by the sun. "You will stay there. Keep to yourself. And you do not go near my daughter." Grace raised an eyebrow, a flicker of her old preacher's daughter defiance showing through. "I had no plans on braiding anyone's hair, Mr. Hayes." His expression hardened. "She does not talk. Hasn't since her mother passed a year ago. That is not your concern. Do the job. Stay out of the rest." Grace met his gaze without flinching, holding it for a long moment where words would have only failed. She nodded once. "When do I start?" Calder looked toward the falling sun, a fiery gash in the western sky. Now, the shed was cleaner than she expected. One caught one small wood stove and a single window facing east. It was a cell, but it was a safe one. As twilight bled across the plains, Grace lit a lantern and unpacked. Flour wrapped in oilcloth, a precious tin of salt, and her mother's rolling pin, worn smooth from years of prayerful use. These were the tools of her trade, the only inheritance she had left. She rose before dawn. The ranch was a world of silhouettes sleeping save for a lone rooster and the soft rustling of horses in the dark. With fingers numb from the pre-dawn chill, she split kindling, lit the stove, and began to work the dough. Her hands, though rough from travel, moved with a quiet, practiced precision. There was no sugar, but the bread would hold. It would be honest bread. By sunrise, the warm, yeasty breath of the rising dough drifted past the barn and into the open air. Her arms were dusted in flour, and her hands moved without conscious thought. Fold, press, roll, score. It was a liturgy she knew by heart. That was when she saw the child. A little girl no more than 4 stood at the edge of the barn's shadow. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess, her small face smudged with dirt. She clutched a doll that looked more like a bundle of rags than a toy. She did not speak, did not move. She just watched, her eyes wide and unnervingly still in the pale morning light. Grace felt a pang in her chest, a memory of a life before running. She said nothing. She simply took one of the smaller, rounder loaves, wrapped it in a clean square of cloth, and placed it on the porch rail of the main house. When she looked back moments later, the girl was gone. That evening, as Grace cleaned her small shed, Calder appeared at the door. He took a roll from the basket she'd left for the men on the main house porch, bit into it without a word, and chewed thoughtfully. "Not bad," he grunted. "I was baking before I ever believed in anything," Grace replied, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. He paused at the door, his silhouette framed against the deep purple of the evening sky. "Do not forget what I said." "I remember." He left. She returned to her cot, and the solitude a welcome blanket. Later, before blowing out the lantern, she stepped outside for a breath of cool night air. The cloth she had wrapped the bread in was gone. In its place, resting on the wooden railing, was a single perfect white wildflower. Sometimes the prairie does not shout its intentions. It whispers. And if you listen close enough in the vast and wounded silence of a place like this, you can hear the start of something worth staying for. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the oven. Grace had found the remains of an old firestone oven behind the main house, a collapsed dome of river rock and crumbling clay. She rebuilt it by hand, mixing clay from the creek bed with ash and water, stacking the stones with a patient determination that surprised even herself. It stood now just beyond the reach of the cattle fence, a warm, breathing creature in the cool mornings. Her hands, once soft from turning pages of scripture, were now calloused and strong. Measure mixed need. The gritty feel of flour under her fingernails became a comfort. Dust clouded the morning light as it poured into her shed, illuminating the air like a cathedral. The dough took shape under her palms, quiet and resilient, a living thing. Each morning she baked 8 long loaves for the ranch hands, 2 round boolies for the Saturday market, and 1 small perfect roll she did not mention to anyone. That one she wrapped in a faded square of floral cloth. No name, no note, just bread still warm from the oven's heart. And every morning she left it at the base of an old wooden swing that hung from a lone cottonwood tree behind the barn. That was where the child sat. Annie Hayes. 4 years old, white blonde hair always tangled by the wind eyes, always cautious. She never spoke, never reached for the bread while Grace was there. She just sat on the swing's worn wooden plank, her rag doll in her lap, her bare feet hovering above the dust, watching. Grace respected the silent boundary between them. She never tried to approach, never waved, never called the girl's name. She simply set the bread down and walked away. And every evening when she returned to collect the cloth, the bread was gone. She knew Calder saw it. Once or twice she caught him leaning against a far fence post, arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight. But he never said a word. He did not stop her. He did not thank her. He just watched. And in a place where watching was often more honest than speaking, that was enough. One afternoon the wind changed. It came in fast from the east, a hot, dry breath that swept through the yard in violent gusts. The oven was already hot, the flames licking the edges of the stones. Grace had just turned to fetch a pail of water when a particularly strong gust hit. It lifted a cluster of dry straw stacked beside her shed, sending it skittering across the yard. A single live coal, spat from the oven's mouth, landed in its midst. The straw erupted into a whoosh of orange flame. Grace turned her eyes wide with disbelief. "Damn it! No!" she gasped, grabbing the bucket beside her door. But the wind was a cruel and eager partner. The flames danced into the dry grass, racing toward the edge of a large wood pile. Her skirts brushed against the fire as she desperately beat at the spreading blaze with a wet burlap sack. Smoke stung her eyes and filled her lungs, then the thunder of boots on hard-packed earth. Calder appeared through the haze, his shirt already pulled up over his mouth and nose. He grabbed another pail from the water trough, drenching a section of the fire, then stomped through the remaining flames without hesitation. Water hit the blaze with a satisfying hiss. He threw his heavy coat over a burning patch near the shed wall. Together they battled it, coughing, slapping, stomping, until the last wisp of smoke curled up and vanished into the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. Grace fell to her knees, choking on the acrid smoke. Her right hand throbbed the skin red and raw from the heat. Calder dropped beside her, his movements surprisingly gentle as he reached for her wrist. "Let me see," he commanded, his voice low. "It is fine," she winced, trying to pull away. "Let me see." His tone left no room for argument. She surrendered her hand. He opened a small dented tin from his coat pocket, a salve he had carried since the winter, and began to gently smear the cool balm over her palm and up her wrist. Her breath caught not from the pain, but from the unexpected tenderness of his touch. His rough, calloused fingers were impossibly careful against her burned skin. "You did not have to risk the shed," she whispered, her gaze fixed on his hands. "I did not need someone to save my oven either." He replied, his voice gruff, but lacking its usual edge. "But you did." Their eyes met. For a long moment they were not employer and hired help, not yet anything else. Just two people in a field of smoke and ash, bound for a moment by something neither of them could name. He stood first, brushing soot from his sleeves. She watched him walk back toward the barn, a dark, solid figure against the orange twilight. The wind had quieted. The oven still stood. The next morning, when she took the small loaf to the swing, the cloth from the day before was folded neatly on the seat. The bread had been taken again. The next morning, the swing was empty. Grace felt a flicker of disappointment, but pushed it down. She did not look for the child. She simply worked as she always did, kneading the dough, turning it over and over, her fingers moving, with the care of someone shaping more than just bread. But this time, when she looked up from her mixing bowl, Annie was standing closer than ever before. Not at the porch, not at the barn, but right there by the corner of the new stone oven, her rag doll tucked securely beneath one arm. Grace kept her movements slow, deliberate. "You want to help?" she asked softly, not expecting an answer. The child stepped forward. She did not speak, but she reached up, her small, clean fingers dipping into the flour-dusted bowl. She pressed them into the soft dough, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as if touching something alive. Grace smiled, a genuine, gentle curve of her lips. She tore off a small lump of dough, set it on a wooden board, and picked up a dull carving knife. With a few quick flicks of her wrist, she shaped a sun with long, wavering rays. She handed the knife to Annie. "Your turn." Annie hesitated for only a second before taking the knife. With intense concentration, she carved something uneven and charming, 4 legs, a tail, a long neck. "A horse," Grace guessed. Annie nodded, once a shy, pleased dip of her chin. For the next hour they worked side by side in companionable silence, making faces out of dough. Cats with crooked smiles, birds with button eyes, stars and lopsided hearts. Annie's tongue peeked from the corner of her mouth as she worked, completely absorbed. When they placed the small figures in the oven, Grace whispered, "Now comes the magic." Annie sat cross-legged beside her, watching through the open mouth of the firestone. As the heat rose, the shapes expanded, softened and browned. And then it happened. The dough horse puffed so wide, it tipped over, landing with its belly up and its legs askew in a comical surrender. Annie blinked, and then she laughed. It was not a loud or long sound, but it was unmistakably real. High-pitched and airy, like a breath catching sunlight. The sound froze Grace in place. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with wonder. Annie immediately covered her mouth with her hands, as if startled and frightened by the sound of her own joy. But Grace said nothing to draw attention to it. She only smiled and reached into the oven with a wooden paddle to retrieve the misshapen horse. "It is the first one I have ever seen that knows to lie down after a long ride," she said softly. From the window of the main house, Calder watched. He did not move. He only stood there, arms folded across his chest, his eyes fixed on the 2 figures crouched by the fire. His face gave nothing away, but his hand tightened once on the windowsill before he turned away from the light. That night, Grace returned to her shed to find a bundle of dry wood stacked neatly beside the door, cut and tied with twine. Enough for 3 days. No note, no word. She smiled to herself and carried it inside. Later, under the quiet flicker of her oil lamp, she heard footsteps approach slow and steady. A knock at her door. She opened it to find Calder, hat in hand, his face half in shadow, half in firelight. "Do you need more flour?" he asked, his voice low. "I have enough for tomorrow." He stood there a moment longer, shifting his weight. She laughed. Grace nodded. She did. They stood in the heavy silence that seemed to be his native language. Calder looked down at his boots. "She has not made a sound like that in a year. Not one. I did not try to make her." Grace said, her voice gentle. He lifted his eyes, and in their depths she saw a flicker of something raw and grateful. That is probably why it happened. Another long pause. He stepped back as if to leave, but then stopped. "Where did you learn to bake like that?" Grace looked down at her flour-stained hands. "My mother taught me. I used to help her prepare the Sunday bread. The kind, she said, could make a man weep if you let it rise too long." "Is that why you left home?" "The bread." The question was unexpected, a rare crack in his guarded facade. She met his eyes, her own expression unreadable. "I did not run from anything, Mr. Hayes. I am just looking for a place where I can breathe." He held her gaze, and for the first time, she saw the harsh lines around his eyes soften. He tipped his hat, a gesture of respect she hadn't seen from him before, and turned back into the dark. Grace watched him go, her heart beating a quiet, steady rhythm under her apron. She returned to her cot, the scent of baked bread still clinging to her skin, and the sound of a child's laugh echoing in the corners of her little shed. It was not much, but it was more than she had yesterday. The whispers began in town, small and insidious, the way rumors always do. They were traded between sacks of flour at the general store behind hymnals at the Sunday service. "She bakes in his yard lives by his barn, and she's not kin." A grown man, widowed with a girl to raise. And now a young woman's moved in like a ghost from nowhere. Grace Evans, wasn't she that preacher's daughter from Kansas? Ran off, didn't she? The wind carried it all. Grace heard none of it, insulated by the 10 miles of rugged terrain and the wall of silence Calder had built around his life. But Calder heard it, and so did the men who worked for him. By the second market day, heads turned when Grace passed with her baskets of bread. Some offered hesitant smiles, others muttered and looked away. Grace kept her eyes on her work, but gossip, once it finds breath, tends to grow teeth. One afternoon it came riding in on horseback. Silas Blackwood arrived coated in a fine layer of road dust, but his black coat was still immaculate, his posture ramrod straight. He was not there for bread. He dismounted with an easy grace and strode into the yard as if he already owned it. His gaze sweeping over the barn, the house, and finally settling on Calder, who was repairing a fence post nearby. Grace, pulling the last loaves from the Firestone oven, felt a cold dread wash over her. Annie was sitting quietly in the swing, humming tunelessly to herself. Hayes Blackwood called out, his voice smooth as polished riverstone. "I trust you've reconsidered my offer. It's a generous one. More than this dry patch of earth is worth." Calder didn't look up from his work. He set another post into the ground with a heavy thud. "My land isn't for sale, Blackwood. Everything is for sale," Silas countered, stepping closer. His eyes flickered toward Grace, a brief dismissive glance, before returning to Calder. "I am offering you a chance to walk away with something in your pocket. A man has a duty to his family, Hayes. A duty to protect them. This ranch, it has a history of taking things from you, doesn't it?" The veiled threat hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Calder straightened up slowly, his hammer held loosely in one hand. "My family is my business. You are not welcome here." Silas chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "A pity. Progress has a way of finding the stubborn ones, almost as if the land itself rejects them." His eyes glinted, and he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in Grace's direction. It's a pity how misfortune seems to follow those who stand against it. Grace froze, the silver gleam of a pocket watch flashing in her memory. He knew, or he suspected. The casual threat was not just for Calder. It was a message for her. Her hiding place was no longer safe. Calder took a step forward, his knuckles white around the handle of the hammer. "Get off my land." Blackwood held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "As you wish. For now." He turned and walked back to his horse, moving with the unhurried confidence of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. He mounted, gave one last lingering look at the ranch, and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and a suffocating sense of menace in his wake. The yard fell silent. Annie had stopped humming. Grace stood by the oven, the warmth of the stones doing nothing to chase the chill from her bones. Calder remained by the fence, staring after the retreating figure, his face a mask of grim determination. He had rejected the offer, escalating a conflict he did not yet understand. And Grace knew with a certainty that settled like ice in her veins that Silas Blackwood would be back. The bond between Grace and Annie grew in the quiet spaces of the day, woven together with flower and sunlight. Annie began to follow her through her chores, a silent, watchful shadow. She helped carry kindling, her small arms wrapped around 2 or 3 sticks at a time. She sat on a stool in the shed, watching Grace knead dough, her expression one of solemn concentration. One morning, Grace was humming a simple hymn her mother used to sing while baking. When she paused, she heard a tiny, reedy voice from the corner hum the next few notes. It was the first sound, other than the laugh, that she had heard Annie make. Their connection culminated one afternoon beside the creek. Grace was gathering smooth, flat stones for the oven, and Annie was trailing her fingers in the cool water. "Mama used to sing?" Annie said, her voice so soft it was almost carried away by the gurgling stream. Grace stopped, her heart lurching. She turned slowly. "Did she?" Annie nodded, looking at her reflection in the water. She sang sad songs. It was the first sentence, the first memory shared. Grace sat on the bank beside her, not pushing, not probing, just listening to the space Annie had opened. That same week, while cleaning the main house, a task she had taken upon herself without being asked, Grace found a small locked chest under the bed in the master bedroom. The key was in a jar on the mantel. Hesitantly, she opened it. Inside were not treasures, but sorrows. A stack of letters tied with a ribbon, written in a delicate, spidery hand, and a single photograph. It showed Calder and a woman with Annie's blonde hair and a strained, unhappy smile. The letters from the woman, Martha, to a sister back east spoke of a profound loneliness, of feeling like a ghost on her own land, of a husband who was good and kind, but who loved the earth beneath his feet more than the woman who walked upon it. "He gave me a home." One letter read, "But I do not feel at home here." The discovery troubled Grace. It complicated the simple narrative of a grieving husband. It painted a portrait of a marriage that was not a tragedy of loss, but perhaps a tragedy of misunderstanding. As Grace's influence softened the hard edges of the ranch, Calder began to change. He started taking his evening meal with her and Annie at the small table in the main house kitchen. The conversations were stilted at first, full of long pauses, but gradually he began to talk. He spoke of the seasons of the cattle, of the way the light changed over the mesas. He was a man who knew the language of the land far better than the language of the heart. But the shadow of Silas Blackwood lingered. The sabotage began subtly. A section of fence was cut one night, and a dozen head of cattle wandered off, taking 2 days to round up. A week later, Grace went to the well to draw water and found it fouled, the water murky and smelling of rot. They were forced to haul water from the creek, a back-breaking task that exhausted them all. Calder knew it was Blackwood's work, a slow, deliberate strangling of the ranch's resources. The tension came to a head one starless night. A fire broke out in the main barn. It wasn't an accident. A lantern had been knocked over near a stack of dry hay. The ranch hands shouted, running with buckets, their faces lit by the terrifying orange glow. Calder and Grace worked side by side, their movements frantic but synchronized. He directed the men, his voice a commanding roar over the crackle of the flames, while Grace led the panicked horses out of their stalls, her voice a low, calming murmur that cut through their terror. Soot stained their faces and smoke filled their lungs, but together they fought the blaze back from the brink, saving the barn and the animals within it. In the exhausted, ash-covered aftermath, as the last of the embers died down, they stood together near the smoldering barn wall. Their shared vulnerability was a raw, palpable thing in the smoky air. "He is trying to break you," Grace said, her voice hoarse. "He will fail," Calder replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. He looked at the barn, at the home he had built, at the life that was being systematically dismantled. Later that night, unable to sleep, Grace found him sitting on the porch steps, staring into the darkness. She brought him a cup of water and sat beside him. "I found her letters," she said softly. "Martha's." He didn't flinch. He just continued to stare at the horizon. "I know." She was not happy here. A long silence stretched between them. Finally he spoke, his voice thick with a grief that sounded older and more complex than she had realized. "I loved her," he said, "but I did not know how to make her happy. I gave her land, a house, a child. I thought it was enough. I thought my work was a way of loving her. But she needed words. She needed a different kind of quiet. I failed her long before the stampede." It was a confession that cost him everything. In that moment of shared truth, something shifted between them. He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the faint starlight. "This land has taken everything from me," he said. "My parents, my wife. I will not let it take this. I will not let him take you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple silver ring worn smooth with time. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She said a home is not built with wood and nails, but with hands that hold on." He held it out to her. "I'm not a man for speeches, Grace, but I know what I feel when I see you with my daughter. I see a new beginning." Tears streamed down Grace's soot-stained cheeks as she let him slide the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The isolation tightened like a noose. Enraged by Calder's refusal to break, Silas Blackwood changed tactics. He rode into redemption not with threats of violence, but with whispers of poison. He spoke to the mayor over whiskey, to the mercantile owner over accounts, to the ranchers at the cattle auction. He painted a picture of Calder Hayes as a man unhinged by grief, a recluse whose ranch was failing, whose judgment could not be trusted. A tragedy, what happened to his wife. Silas would say, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Some men never recover. The ranch is falling to ruin. It's a danger to his own child." He bought debts, called in favors, and wielded his influence like a club. When Calder's loyal foreman, a man named Jed, went to town for supplies, he was turned away. The general store was suddenly out of stock of flour and salt. The blacksmith couldn't spare the time to shoe their horses. The bank reviewed Calder's line of credit and found it wanting. Redemption, a town that had once been indifferent, now became actively hostile. The whispers that had once been about Grace now focused on Calder. They were cut off an island in a sea of suspicion. The ranch hands grew restless. 2 of them, seeing no future, collected their pay and left without a word. The pressure mounted daily. Calder grew quieter, the lines on his face deepening. He spent his days mending the same fences, his movements tight with a contained rage. Grace watched him, her heart aching. The silver ring on her finger felt both like a promise and a burden. She was the reason Blackwood was here. Her past had finally caught up to her, and it was destroying the first place she had ever felt safe. One evening, as she and Calder sat in the near-empty kitchen, the silence was broken by Annie. The little girl, who now spoke in full, clear sentences, looked from her father's grim face to Grace's worried one. "Is the bad man coming back?" she asked, her voice small. Calder placed his hand over Grace's on the table. "I will not let anyone hurt you," he said, his words meant for both of them. But Grace knew it was no longer about a simple fight. Blackwood was not trying to win a brawl in the yard. He was trying to win a war of attrition. He was starving them out, turning them into pariahs. He was not just trying to take the land. He was trying to erase them from it, to make it as if the Hayes Ranch and everyone on it had never existed at all. Their world had shrunk to the boundaries of their fences, and beyond that lay an enemy they could not fight with their fists. The sky had been a strange bruised yellow all day. The air was heavy and still thick with an unspoken threat. By late afternoon, the wind began to howl a low, mournful cry that rose in pitch until it became a maddening shriek. A sandstorm. It descended on the ranch like a biblical plague, a roaring, churning wall of brown that swallowed the sun and plunged the world into a gritty twilight. "Get the animals into the barn." Calder bellowed over the wind, his voice nearly torn away by the gale. Grace, her hair whipping across her face, grabbed Annie's hand and ran for the house, while Calder and Jed herded the last of the horses into the relative safety of the barn. The storm hit with full force. Dust and sand blasted against the walls, finding its way through every crack and crevice. The world outside the windows vanished into a maelstrom of dirt. Inside the small house, Grace held Annie close, the child trembling, as the wooden structure groaned and shuddered under the assault. An hour passed, then another. The roar of the wind was relentless. Suddenly, a lull. The shrieking dropped to a low moan. In that eerie quiet, they heard it. The splintering of wood. The front door burst open, ripped from its hinges, and Silas Blackwood stood there, a specter framed against the swirling dust. He was not alone. Two hard-faced men stood behind him. "I told you progress would roll over you, Hayes." Blackwood said, his voice calm and terrifying in the relative silence. He stepped inside, shaking dust from his coat. Before Grace could react, Calder burst in from the back door, having come from the barn. His face was grim, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. Jed was right behind him. "This ends now," Blackwood Calder said, his voice a low growl. Silas smiled. "Oh, it ended a long time ago. I am just here to collect." He gestured to the house, the land, everything. "This was never about your land." "Not really." He took a step closer, his dark eyes fixed on Calder with an intensity that burned with something far hotter than greed. "This is about my sister." The words hung in the dust-choked air. Calder stared, uncomprehending. "What are you talking about?" "Martha Blackwood," Silas said, savoring each syllable. "My younger sister. The girl you dragged out to this godforsaken wasteland and left to wither like a forgotten flower. The woman who died because you were too busy tending your precious dirt to notice she was slipping away. Her letters stopped coming a month before she died. She was desperate. She was alone. Her death in that stampede was no accident. It was the result of your neglect." The revelation struck Calder like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, the shotgun lowering slightly. You're Martha's brother. I am her vengeance." Silas hissed, his polite facade finally cracking to reveal the raw hatred beneath. He pulled a pistol from his coat. "I spent a year destroying you from the outside. Now I will finish it from the inside." He raised the pistol, aiming it squarely at Calder's chest. Annie screamed, a piercing cry of pure terror burying her face in Grace's skirt. Time seemed to slow. Grace saw the hammer of the pistol pull back. She saw the despair and confusion in Calder's eyes. And she saw dangling from Silas's waistcoat, as he moved the glint of silver, the pocket watch. The watch, Grace said, her voice clear and sharp, cutting through the tension. Silas paused, his eyes flicking to her. What? The silver pocket watch, she repeated, stepping forward, placing herself slightly in front of Calder. Where did you get it? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Silas's face. It was a gift. It has no meaning to you. It means everything to me. Grace said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a righteous anger that burned away her fear. That watch did not belong to you. It belonged to a man named Abernathy in Kansas. He was a powerful man who wanted my father's land for the railroad. My father was a preacher who refused to sell. One night, Abernathy sent men to his study to persuade him. Her gaze locked with Silas's, and she saw the flicker of recognition, of shock in his eyes. You were one of those men, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. You stood there in the shadows while your partner killed my father. I saw you. I saw that watch. Abernathy didn't just pay you in coin, did he? He paid you with a trinket from a dead man's pocket. The truth shattered the room. Silas's conviction, the righteous fury that had driven him for a year, began to crumble. He was not a grieving brother enacting justice. He was a hired thug, a man whose personal tragedy had been manipulated and used by a greater evil. His grief was real, but his cause was a lie. You're a pawn, Silas, Grace said, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute certainty. Abernathy used your pain to get what he wanted. Just like he's using you now to get this land. You are not vengeance. You are just another man's weapon. Silas stared at her, then at the watch in his own hand, as if seeing it for the first time. His pistol wavered. The wind howled outside, a chorus for a broken man's soul. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. The wind died down, leaving behind a world draped in a thick blanket of silence and coated in a fine red dust. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long, dramatic shafts of light into the wrecked farmhouse. Silas Blackwood stood in the center of the room, a man hollowed out. Grace's revelation had not just disarmed him, it had broken him. The pistol lay on the floor where he had dropped it. His face was a mask of anguish and confusion, and the face of a man who had lost his purpose. His righteous crusade revealed as a bitter lie. The heavy tread of boots on the porch announced the arrival of the town sheriff, flanked by 2 deputies. Jed, in the chaos of the storm's beginning, had slipped away on the fastest horse and ridden like the devil himself to fetch the law, his loyalty to Calder overriding his fear. Silas Blackwood, the sheriff, said, his voice weary. You're under arrest. For the fire at the Hayes barn, the fouled well, and a long list of other complaints that are suddenly making a lot more sense. Silas didn't resist. He allowed the deputies to bind his hands, his movements slow and mechanical. As they led him away, his eyes met Calder's. There was no hatred left in them, only a vast, empty sorrow. She loved wildflowers, he said, his voice a choked whisper. Did you know that? Calder simply nodded at the anger drained out of him, replaced by a profound, aching pity. After they were gone, an immense quiet settled over the house. Grace Calder and Annie stood together in the dusty, sunlit ruin of their home. The events of the past hour, the storm, the confrontation, the shattering truths lay between them. Calder turned to Grace, his eyes filled with 1,000 questions. All this time? You were running from him. Grace nodded, tears finally tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. I never thought he would find me. I'm sorry, Calder. I brought this trouble to your door. He stepped forward and gently took her hands in his. His touch was firm, grounding. No, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You brought truth to it. You saved us. He looked down at their joined hands, at the silver ring on her finger. I thought I was mourning a wife I had failed. But I was mourning a ghost. A story I told myself. Now I can finally mourn Martha for who she was. He finally let go of the guilt that had been his constant companion for a year. He was free. They spent the rest of the day cleaning, sweeping away the dust and debris, righting overturned furniture. Every shared task, every quiet glance, was a stitch knitting their fractured world back together. That night, they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in a sky washed clean by the storm. Annie was asleep inside, clutching the rag doll. "Abernathy is still out there," Grace said softly, voicing the fear that lingered. "Then we will face him." Calder said, his voice calm and certain. "Together. You do not have to be invisible anymore, Grace." He put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion and the profound, incredible lightness of being safe. Their bond forged in silence, and Flower had been tested by fire and storm and had emerged stronger, truer, and unbreakable. 1 year later, the Hayes Ranch was transformed. The wind still rolled off the high plains, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It carried the scent of fresh-baked bread and the distant happy shouts of children. Where the old forgotten shed had once leaned, a new building now stood painted white with wide windows that drank in the morning sun. A hand-carved sign hung above the doorway, its letters burned carefully into the wood. The Bread Camp. Inside, 10 children from surrounding farms and the town of Redemption gathered each morning. They were children of silence, children of trauma, children who had lost their words somewhere along the hard road of their young lives. Grace, her belly gently rounded with new life, stood at the front, her hands moving with the same practiced care as always. She taught them how to knead, how to fold, how to shape dough, not just with their palms, but with their patience. And as their hands worked, their voices returned. Shyly at first, then, with growing confidence. Annie, now a bright and talkative 5-year-old, was her mother's best assistant, her clear voice reading stories aloud as the bread cooled on the racks. Calder had changed too. The harsh lines on his face had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He had rebuilt the back room of the barn into a small library filled with donated books. He spent his afternoons there carving small wooden animals for the children, his hands as skilled with a block of wood as they were with a rope or a hammer. He and Grace were married, their quiet vows spoken under the same cottonwood tree where she had once left loaves of bread for a silent little girl. One crisp autumn afternoon, Calder came to the schoolhouse door. He was holding a small, heavy object wrapped in cloth. "It is time," he said softly. He and Grace walked to the new anvil the town blacksmith had given them as a wedding present. He unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay the silver shell of Silas Blackwood's pocket watch. The inner workings had been removed, leaving only the intricately engraved casing, the object of Grace's trauma. With a steady hand, Calder placed the silver into the forge. They watched as the metal glowed, softened, and lost its shape, the painful memories melting away with the filigree. He then hammered the molten silver, shaping it not into a ring or an ornament, but into a small, simple bell. It cooled slowly, its surface imperfect but beautiful. Together, they hung the bell above the door of the schoolhouse. Calder lifted Annie into his arms. "Ring it, sweetheart," Grace whispered, her hand resting on his. "Ring it for the whole world to hear." Annie reached out with a small, steady hand and pulled the cord. A sound clear and bright echoed across the ranch. It was not the sound of time running out like the ticking of a watch, but the sound of a new beginning, a call to gather, a symbol of pain transformed into a song of hope. Its pure tone rang out over the plains, a testament to love that had risen slow and patient like bread warming by a fire.